There is a particular kind of myth that forms around German armor in World War II. It is the myth of the invincible machine, the tiger cresting a hill, the panther holding a road, the steel embodiment of a war machine that should have won and somehow did not. It is a myth built on enough genuine technical fact to survive casual scrutiny, and it distorts the actual history badly enough to make the real story almost unrecognizable. The real story is more interesting and more instructive. German tank development between 1939 and 1945 was not a linear march toward increasing lethality. It was a series of improvisations, miscalculations, industrial compromises, and doctrinal arguments, some of them brilliant, and some of them catastrophic, conducted under the accelerating pressure of a war that was consuming armor faster than factories could replace it. The tanks that emerged from this process ranged from some of the most formidable armored fighting vehicles ever built to some of the most mechanically unreliable, strategically misapplied, and operationally irrelevant machines in the history of armored warfare. Understanding the difference between those categories and why Germany produced both simultaneously is the key to understanding not just the tank war, but the entire arc of German military power from its peak to its collapse. 1. The Panzer I and Panzer II. The training wheels that went to war begin where the German armored force actually began, because the starting point tells you almost everything about the compromises that followed. The Panzer I was never designed to fight. This is not revisionist framing. It was the explicit operational concept under which the vehicle was developed in the early 1930s. Germany, still bound by the armament restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, needed a platform to train its nascent armored force in the doctrines and tactics that theorists like Heinz Guderian were developing. The Panzer I was a training vehicle, a mechanized classroom, armed with two 7.92mm machine guns and protected by armor that a heavy rifle round could penetrate at combat range. Then September of 1939 arrived, and the training vehicle went to war in Poland alongside everything else Germany could field. The Panzer II was a marginal improvement, a 20mm autocannon replacing the machine gun armament, slightly heavier armor, modestly better mechanical reliability, but it remained fundamentally unsuited to the tank versus tank engagements that modern armored warfare would inevitably produce. Against Polish cavalry, against light tankettes, against the thin-skinned vehicles of the early campaigns, the Panzer II could perform adequately. Against the French Char B-1 and Matilda tanks it encountered in 1940, its gun was operationally irrelevant. What saved the German armored force in 1940 was not the Panzer I or Panzer II. It was doctrine. Guderian's concept of concentrated armored breakthrough, massing armor at a single point, driving deep into the enemy rear before the defensive command cycle could respond, creating operational paralysis rather than tactical attrition. Worked in France not because German tanks were superior to French tanks. In many individual technical categories, they were not. It worked because the French had better tanks, worse doctrine, and a command system that processed information so slowly that by the time a response was authorized, the situation it was responding to had ceased to exist. The Panzer I and II were phased out of frontline service progressively through the early war years, repurposed as reconnaissance vehicles, command tanks, and the chassis for improvised self-propelled guns. Their significance is not what they achieved in combat. It is what they represent about the distance between what Germany's armored doctrine required and what Germany's industrial and geopolitical situation permitted in the 1930s. 2. The Panzer III. The backbone that was always one step behind. The Panzer III was supposed to be the main battle tank of the German armored force, the vehicle around which Guderian's doctrine would be built, capable of engaging enemy armor on equal terms while the Panzer IV handled infantry support. For a period of approximately 2 years, from the French campaign through the opening phase of Barbarossa, it was exactly that. The Panzer III in its early variants, armed with the 37mm gun, then upgraded to the 50mm, was competitive against most of the armor it encountered. It was mechanically reliable by the standards of the era. It was produced in sufficient numbers to constitute a genuine armored backbone, and it was operated by crews whose training and tactical doctrine gave them a consistent edge against opponents who, on paper, sometimes had better machines. The problem was Soviet armor. When German tank crews encountered the T-34 In the summer of 1941, the operational shock was genuine and immediate. The T-34's sloped armor deflected rounds from the standard Panzer III 50mm gun at combat ranges. Its wide tracks gave it mobility in mud and snow that the narrower-tracked German vehicles could not match. Its 76mm gun penetrated the Panzer III's armor at distances where the Panzer III could not effectively return fire. If you're finding the mechanism beneath the headline, why these machines performed the way they did, and what it cost when they didn't, hit the like button. This is exactly the level this channel operates at. The German response was to upgrade a longer, higher velocity 50mm gun, then an attempted adaptation to mount a 75mm weapon that the Panzer III's turret ring ultimately could not accommodate. By 1942, the Panzer III was in the process of being outclassed by the primary opponent it was most frequently encountering on the most important front of the war. Upgunning had limits. At some point, the hull was simply too small, the turret ring too narrow, the fundamental design parameters too constraining to accommodate the weapon the battlefield required. Production of the Panzer III was wound down through 1943. The chassis survived, repurposed as the basis for the Stugge 3 assault gun, which would become one of the most produced and arguably most cost-effective German armored vehicles of the entire war. But as a main battle tank, the Panzer III's operational window had closed. It had been the backbone of the most effective armored force in the world for 2 years, and it had been overtaken by a war that moved faster than its design could follow. 3. The Panzer IV, the workhorse that actually won the tank war. Here is where the myth and the reality diverge most sharply, because the tank most associated with German armored power in popular imagination, the Tiger, was never the backbone of the German armored force. The Panzer IV was. From the first day of the war to the last, in larger numbers than any other German tank, in every theater from North Africa to the Eastern Front to Normandy, the Panzer IV began the war as an infantry support vehicle. Short-barreled 75mm gun designed to fire high explosive rounds against enemy positions rather than penetrate armor. By 1943, through a series of progressive upgrades that represent some of the most effective engineering decisions of the German tank program, it had been transformed into a genuine main battle tank, carrying a long-barreled 75mm high-velocity gun capable of defeating T-34 and Sherman armor at combat ranges. This transformation matters because it illustrates what German armor could accomplish when engineering pragmatism was allowed to operate without ideological interference or prestige project distortion. The Panzer IV was not glamorous. It did not inspire propaganda films or generate the mythology that attached itself to the Tiger. It was a practical vehicle, progressively improved, produced in numbers that the Tiger and Panther programs never approached, and maintained by crews who understood its capabilities and limitations with the familiarity that comes from years of operational experience. Save this one, the Panzer IV's story, the unglamorous workhorse consistently outperforming the prestigious projects, is a pattern that runs through military and industrial history well beyond World War II. And this is the reference point you will want when that argument comes up again. By 1944, the upgunned Panzer IV, with its long 75, was a competitive vehicle against the primary Allied tanks it encountered. Not dominant, the days of German armored dominance on any front were over, but competitive. A well-trained crew in a late-model Panzer IV could kill a Sherman or a T-34 at reasonable combat ranges, maintain a reasonable operational tempo, and be repaired and returned to service with the spare parts and maintenance infrastructure that the more technically complex later designs could not rely on. The final production count for the Panzer IV, approximately 8,500 vehicles across all variants, dwarfs the combined production of the Tiger I, Tiger II, and Panther. It fought in every major German campaign of the entire war. It was there at the beginning in Poland, and it was there at the end in Berlin. The tank that actually carried the weight of German armored warfare for 6 years is the one that gets the fewest pages in the popular histories, because it was never the most impressive machine in the inventory. It was only the most important one. 4. The Panther. The best tank. Germany built in the program that nearly broke the army. The T-34 shock of 1941 produced two distinct German responses. The pragmatic response was the upgunned Panzer IV. The prestige response was the Panther. developed as a direct answer to the T-34. The Panther incorporated sloped armor geometry copied from Soviet design philosophy, a high-velocity 75mm gun that was arguably the finest tank gun of the entire war in terms of penetration performance at combat range, and a level of overall design ambition that produced a vehicle which, when it worked, was genuinely formidable. When it worked is the critical qualifier. The Panther was introduced operationally at the Battle of Kursk in July of 1943, the largest tank battle in history. And its debut was a mechanical disaster. Of the approximately 200 Panthers committed to the initial operation, a significant proportion broke down before they reached the battle. Transmission failures, engine fires, final drive failures that left vehicles immobilized with no enemy contact. The vehicle had been rushed into production before the engineering problems revealed in testing had been adequately resolved, under pressure from Hitler to deploy it for the prestige offensive that Kursk represented. The mechanical problems were progressively addressed through production improvements, and by 1944, the Panther, in its later variants, was a substantially more reliable vehicle than the Kursk machines had been. Its gun could penetrate the frontal armor of every Allied tank in service at ranges where those tanks could not reliably penetrate its own frontal protection. In a static defensive engagement on terrain that favored its gun range, operated by an experienced crew, the Panther was as capable a tank as any fielded by any nation in the war. The operational context of 1944 did not consistently provide static defensive engagements on favorable terrain operated by experienced crews. It provided fluid, high-tempo warfare against numerically superior Allied forces. Maintenance-intensive vehicles operating with degraded spare parts supply chains, and replacement crews whose training had been compressed to meet attrition demands that the German tank force could not sustain. The Panther also consumed manufacturing resources in materials, in production hours, and specialized components that the Panzer IV program could have converted into 2 or 3 additional vehicles for every Panther produced. Germany built approximately 6,000 Panthers. Had those resources been allocated to Panzer IV production, the numerical result would have been larger, and the reliability result would have been significantly better. This channel is building a picture across these videos. The gap between German military capability in concept and German military capability in practice, and what that gap cost. Subscribe now, because the next layer connects everything we have established into an argument about how military-industrial systems fail that goes well beyond World War II. Whether the Panther was a net positive or net negative for German armored capability in the final 2 years of the war is a genuine debate among serious historians. The answer depends entirely on how you weight technical performance against production numbers, maintenance burden against combat effectiveness, and the value of the ideal engagement against the frequency with which ideal engagements actually occurred. 5. The Tiger, the myth, the machine, and the strategic illusion. No German tank generated more mythology during the war, or has generated more mythology since, than the Tiger I. Allied tank crews developed a condition their commanders called tiger phobia, a tendency to report any German tank as a tiger, regardless of its actual type, to treat contact with German armor as potentially tiger contact until proven otherwise, to make tactical decisions based on the possibility of facing a vehicle whose frontal armor their standard ammunition could not penetrate. The Tiger I earned this reputation. Not its 88mm gun was derived from the legendary Flak 36 anti-aircraft weapon, a gun that had already demonstrated its ability to destroy any tank in existence when German crews in North Africa began using it in the anti-tank role. At realistic combat ranges, there was no Allied tank in service in 1943 or 1944 whose frontal armor the Tiger's gun could not defeat. Its own frontal armor, at 100mm, was proof against the standard Allied tank guns of the same period at combat range. In the specific tactical context for which it was designed, the deliberate assault or defense, the prepared engagement at known range against identified targets, the Tiger I was the most dangerous tank on any battlefield it appeared on. The Tiger I was also 57 tons, mechanically complex beyond any previous German tank design, prone to transmission failures that left it immobilized at operationally critical moments, incapable of crossing most European bridges without engineer preparation, requiring specialized recovery vehicles when disabled, which was frequently and produced at a rate that meant the total number of Tigers that ever existed, approximately 1,347 vehicles, was less than the number of Shermans the United States produced in a typical month. German after-action reports from Tiger units on the Eastern Front contain a pattern that appears too consistently to be coincidental. The Tiger destroys enemy armor at remarkable ratios. Individual Tiger commanders with kill counts of 50, 60, 100 enemy vehicles are documented and credible. The Tiger then breaks down, or runs out of fuel, or cannot be recovered after sustaining a mobility hit, or is lost to air attack while immobile, or is destroyed by its own crew to prevent capture. The tactical brilliance of the Tiger engagement and the operational fragility of the Tiger as a system existed simultaneously, in the same vehicle, in the same battle. By the time the war ended, more Tiger-Is had been lost to mechanical failure, fuel shortage, air attack, and crew demolition than to enemy fire. The myth of the invincible machine and the operational reality of a vehicle that the Wehrmacht could never field in the numbers that would have made its tactical performance strategically decisive coexisted throughout its entire service life. 6. The Tiger. 2. Maximum performance at maximum cost. If the Tiger 1 represented the tension between tactical capability and operational practicality, the Tiger 2, the Königstiger, King Tiger, resolved that tension entirely in favor of capability. And the operational consequences were exactly what the choice implied. At 69 tons, the Tiger 2 was the heaviest tank to see significant operational service in World War II. Its 88mm gun, a longer, higher-velocity weapon than the Tiger 1's already formidable armament, could defeat the frontal armor of any Allied or Soviet tank at ranges approaching 2 kilometers. Its own frontal armor, 150mm of steel angled to increase effective thickness, was effectively impenetrable to the standard anti-tank weapons opposing it. It was also, in operational terms, a vehicle whose reach consistently exceeded its grasp. The Tiger II's weight made it incompatible with the majority of European bridges, requiring engineer bridging operations that consumed time and resources, and announced its presence to any observer. Its fuel consumption was extraordinary. A full fuel load provided a combat range that experienced Tiger commanders described as insufficient for the mobile operations that the tactical situation increasingly demanded. Its mechanical reliability was worse than the Tiger 1's, which had itself been problematic. Replacement parts for its complex systems were perpetually in short supply. At the Battle of Ogledau in August of 1944, a company of Tiger II's encountered Soviet forces and suffered losses that shocked German armor command, not from Soviet anti-tank fire, but from a combination of mechanical failures, fuel exhaustion, and Soviet exploitation of immobilized vehicles. The most formidable tank Germany produced in the war was defeated in its first significant engagement, primarily by the weight of its own ambition. Approximately 490 Tiger II's were produced between January of 1944 and the end of the war. The production resources those vehicles consumed represented a calculation that German armored doctrine and German industrial capacity could not sustain simultaneously. Maximum individual vehicle performance and adequate fleet numbers were, by 1944, mutually exclusive choices. Germany chose maximum performance. The result was a tank that could defeat anything it encountered and was never present in the numbers required to affect the outcome of the battles it fought in. 7. The Stu-G3 and tank destroyers. The vehicles that actually killed the most tanks. Here is the statistic that the mythology of German armor consistently buries. The vehicle responsible for more Allied and Soviet tank kills than any German tank in World War II was not the Tiger. It was not the Panther. It was the Stu-G3. The Sturmgeschütz assault gun, a turretless vehicle built on the Panzer III chassis, mounting a 75mm gun in a fixed casemate, produced in greater numbers than any other German armored fighting vehicle of the entire war. The Stu-G3 existed because of a tactical requirement that predated the tank versus tank engagements that would come to define armored warfare in the popular imagination. Infantry needed direct fire support, a weapon that could accompany foot soldiers, engage enemy fortifications and crew-serve weapons, and provide firepower that artillery could not deliver accurately enough at close range. The turretless casemate design kept the vehicle's profile low, its production cost manageable, and its mechanical complexity within the maintenance capabilities of units that did not have the specialized support infrastructure of panzer divisions. As the war progressed and German armor found itself increasingly on the defensive, the Stu-G3's characteristics translated directly into anti-tank capability. A low-profile vehicle in a prepared defensive position with a gun capable of defeating most Allied and Soviet armor at combat range was a formidable tank killer, and one that cost a fraction of the resources required to produce a Tiger or Panther. The broader family of German tank destroyers, the Jagdpanzer series, the Elephant, the Hetzer, extended this principle through the final years of the war, producing vehicles optimized for the anti-tank defensive mission that German armored forces were predominantly executing. The Jagdpanther, mounting the Panther's gun on a low-profile casemate hull, was arguably the most cost-effective tank-killing vehicle Germany produced in the entire war. The Hetzer, a compact and reliable vehicle built on the Czech Panzer 38 chassis, was produced in significant numbers and operated by crews who found it manageable in the ways that the Tiger and Panther were not. What do you think was the most decisive German armor decision of the war? The one that, reversed, gives German armored power a genuinely different trajectory? Put your argument in the comments. Other people reading this thread have been working through this question for years, and the debate that follows will be worth having. 7 categories of German armor. 7 distinct trajectories, each illuminating a different dimension of the gap between what German tank doctrine envisioned and what German industrial, logistical, and strategic reality could sustain. The training vehicles rushed into combat before a doctrine had tanks worthy of it. The workhorse quietly carrying a war, while the prestige projects absorbed the attention, the T-34 Shock producing 2 responses simultaneously, one pragmatic, one ambitious, and the gap between their outcomes telling you almost everything about how Germany's armored program evolved. The mythological vehicle whose tactical performance and operational fragility coexisted in the same machine, in the same battle, to the end of the war. And the turretless tank destroyer that killed more enemy armor than any of the famous names. In obscurity, because it was cheap enough to build in numbers and reliable enough to be there when it was needed. The question this history leaves genuinely open is the same one that runs through every German military story from this period. At what point did the gap between German armored capability in theory and German armored capability in practice become irreversible? Was it Kursk, where the offensive capacity of the German tank force was permanently broken? Was it the failure to mass-produce a single standardized design rather than proliferating increasingly complex and resource-intensive platforms? Was it the moment Hitler began treating tank development as a prestige project rather than a military requirement? The answer's not settled. The argument is still worth having, and the implications of that gap between the weapon a military force needs and the weapon its industrial and political system actually produces extend well beyond 1945.